As for today, our speaker will be Lindsey Mazurek, who is an assistant professor of archaeology and art history at Indiana University in Bloomington, although presently she is joining us from Athens. Her research explores questions of imperialism, ethnicity, and identity formation in the Roman provinces from the perspectives of religion and mobility. She has published and taught and gave lectures widely on these subjects. She's also co-director of a digital archaeology project, which is called the Mediterranean Connectivity Initiative, which focuses on globalization in the Mediterranean area. Her first book, which was published last year, bears the title Isis in a Global Empire, Greek Identity Through Egyptian Religion in Roman Greece. And it focuses, like today's talk, on the worship of Egyptian deities in Greece during the Roman period. And I think with this, I will just hand the floor over to you, Lindsey, and thank you for accepting our invitation, and thanks for coming.
Thank you so much, Carla and Peter, for having me. Thank you all for logging in. And it's a real pleasure to speak to all of you and about my book and some of the work I've done around it. So with that, I'll just share my screen here and we will get started. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, Egyptian gods like Isis and Serapis became a popular part of Greek religion. Despite their obvious foreignness, shrines and dedications to these deities appear at nearly every major city in the provinces of Achaia, Macedonia, Crete, and the islands that surround them. Their popularity surprises many modern scholars, who have tended to characterize this period and place in terms of its focus on reviving the culture of classical period Athens. Usually studied through a literary movement referred to as the Second Sophistic, identity in Roman Greece has been characterized as a form of hyper-Greekness that collapsed time and space, allowing the colonized people of Roman Greece to claim primacy and superiority through their heritage in a period when imperial structures largely considered them to be of marginal importance within the empire. Isis's popularity then would seem to exist in tension with these cultural priorities. This tension is heightened further by the fact that Isis always remained an Egyptian deity in the Greek imagination. So where exactly she lives becomes a difficult question. In this talk, I argue that Greek devotees tried to resolve this paradox, at least in part, through sanctuary architecture and landscape. The sanctuaries offered opportunities for imaginative placemaking so that Greek devotees might construct their own version of Egypt within which their ideal Isis lived. Still, visitors would not forget they were standing in Greece, often within or just outside city walls and next to sanctuaries of canonical Greek deities. These juxtapositions allow Greeks to claim Egypt as their own, to possess it in miniature and control its expressions. The result then was a space designed to uproot Egypt and replant it on Greek soil. This work is part of my recent book, Isis in a Global Empire, which explores how Greek devotees of Isis interpreted Egyptian religion in the broader context of Roman imperialism. I begin with a brief overview of the worship of Isis and Serapis and the rival in Greece in the early Hellenistic period. Then I turn to literary and artistic depictions of the Nile. In text, Greco-Roman authors from Herodotus to Pliny characterize Egypt as a timeless and strange place through descriptions of its unique flora and fauna. Similarly, wall paintings and mosaics represent the Nile's natural landscape in ways that emphasize ideas of otherness and imperial control. I conclude by discussing landscape sculpture and architecture in Greek sanctuaries. At Dion, the sanctuary was set along a river and atop several natural springs. At sites like Gortina, the sanctuary includes an underground water crypt that echoes Egyptian nilometers, which were used to measure the river's annual flood. Similarly, the sanctuary at Marathon combines fantastic architecture, meant to imagine pharaonic Egyptian temples, archaizing sculpture that evoked a timeless Greco-Egyptian past, and a riverine setting that recalled the Nile. Egyptian sanctuaries are thus constellations of landscape, cult, culture, imagination, style, and politics. By integrating Greek features with Egyptian ones, both real and imagined, These sites produced landscapes that constructed an Egypt that could be easily controlled and possessed by Greek viewers. So let's turn now to the cults. Though Egyptian religion might seem like a rather marginal part of the Greco-Roman world, scholars like Graeco and Martin Bomas have demonstrated that these cults are actually quite popular and quite widespread. The cult first appears in Greece in the late 4th century BCE, brought by Egyptian migrants to port cities like Athens, Delos, and Demetrius. In these cosmopolitan cities, Greeks and other migrant groups quickly adopted Egyptian gods like Isis, Serapis, Harpocrates, and Anubis as their own. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Greek worshippers had largely taken over these cults. From there, Greek migrants and Italian merchants brought the cults to southern Italy, and by the 1st century CE, nearly every city in the empire has a sanctuary dedicated to the Egyptian gods. Given the cult's wide geographic and temporal spread, we can't be sure that these religious practices are standardized, but there do seem to be some common features. The gods were usually worshipped in a triad of Isis, Serapis, and a third god, most often Anubis or the child god Harpocrates. Many sanctuaries feature specialized structures that house water and spaces for communal dining and procession. Many also include objects or imagery meant to recall or reproduce Egypt in some way. But what version of Egypt do Greek devotees wish their Isis to inhabit? Surprisingly, it is not a real or even a realistic rendering of Hellenistic and Roman Egypt. Greek sanctuaries actually contain very few important objects. The slide that I'm showing you here is one of only 11 Egyptian objects found in a Greek Isis sanctuary. Instead, I argue that Greeks built sanctuaries that were founded on their own cultural imaginings of the Nile, often discussed with the term Nilotica. In his study of the Italian material, Michael John Versuis defines the Nilotic aesthetic as a representation of the natural world of the Nile in an ideal, abundant way that does not follow upon Egyptian antecedents. Nilotic scenes create highly stylized and stereotyped versions of the Nile, its banks, and the people and animals that are imagined to dwell there. Most examples are found in wall painting, mosaics, and in three-dimensional assemblages of small sculptures and architectural features. But the Nilotic is fundamentally a cultural and geographic fantasy. It's an imagined landscape that brings far Egypt into these familiar spaces. Now, previously, Greece hasn't really been considered a center for Nilotic imagery, but there is some evidence to suggest that this iconography was in use throughout the Roman period. The best known example is a set of Nilotic glass opus sectile plaques from 4th century CE Kenkriai near Corinth. As reconstructed, the panels fit together to create a frieze 33 meters in length. The themes depict the Nile and other parts of North Africa, particularly the Nile Delta, swamp, and ports. The swamp scenes include animals and plants common to Nilotic imagery, including crocodiles, hippos, lotus plants, flamingos, ducks, and reeds. They really harp on the ducks. As recent restorations have demonstrated, the colors in these panels were very vibrant, which would have further emphasized the Nile's distinctive flora and fauna. Some panels share iconography with their more famous counterparts in Pompeian wall painting. For example, one of the Kenkriai scenes features a human figure riding a crocodile, set within a marshy landscape dotted with herons and lotus plants. Several wall paintings and mosaics from Italy depict similar scenes of crocodile riders, often as part of stereotyped hunt scenes set in Egypt's marshes. For example, a wall painting from the pseudo-peristyle of the Casa del Medico in Pompeii features a crocodile rider in its bottom right corner, which suggests that Greek audiences are quite familiar with the same types of themes and motifs that we see in these well-known Italian examples. I argue that these images are produced in dialogue with long-standing Greek interests in the Nile's landscape. Of course, famously in book 2 of Herodotus' history, flora, fauna, land, and most importantly, the Nile River itself, are central to Herodotus' goal of communicating the marvelous nature of Egypt to his Greek readers. The book begins with a lengthy description of the Nile, including its annual flood, and its ability to provide Egyptians with crops without toil. This version of history here actually might be best compared with things like Ovid's Metamorphoses, where we see not only the humans of the mythic Golden Age are able to create crops without human labor. So this version of Herodotus' history places everyday Egyptians outside of historical time and into an almost mythological register. References to the natural world recur throughout Herodotus' narrative, including lengthy discussions, and quite famous ones, of cats, crocodiles, and hippopotami, as well as more marvelous animals like the phoenix and the sacred snake. In another section, Herodotus examines the Nile's fish with the same inverted perspective that he often uses to describe human Egyptians. Female fish lead the schools homeward, and male fish follow. Vasunia has pointed to this passage in particular as an example of othering Egypt's natural environment in order to construct narratives of alterity. And this rhetoric highlights some common themes that we see in Herodotus' broader representation of Egypt: inversion, fecundity, and marvelousness. Many late classical and early Hellenistic authors critiqued Herodotus' representation of the Nile, but the prevalence of these critiques actually demonstrates that his view of Egypt's landscape persists long after the 5th century BC. Throughout late Republican, early imperial Latin literature, authors like Lucretius, Seneca, Ovid, and Pliny the Elder continued to describe the Nile and its natural landscape in fantastic terms. As Eleni Manolaraki has argued, these works frame Egypt as a timeless, vast space comparable to the depth and extent of the cosmos. These attitudes erase the contemporary inhabitants of the Nile and render Egypt as an immaterial, unknowable place, which is, of course, a fiction because you can go to Egypt, meet Egyptians. It is a place that can be accessed in real life. During the Antonine and Savarine eras, the Nile comes to symbolize a form of imperial rule. Hadrian tends to materialize his deep sorrow over Antonius' death in the form of Egyptianizing material culture, which resulted in the construction of several Egyptianizing buildings at his villa at Tivoli, as well as a general resurgence of interest in Egyptianizing themes across the Mediterranean. One such building, the so-called Campanium, reimagined the Egyptian temple to Serapis and Canopus as a luxurious dining room for Hadrian and his guests. Now, one of the Nile's most fertile home was in Second Sophistic literature. Plutarch, in one of his later philosophical works on Isis and Osiris, uses the Egyptian deities to re-examine Platonic ideas about the nature of the gods. Here, the fantastical version of Egypt observed in earlier texts persists, as when Plutarch equates Isis with the fertility of the Nile Valley and the river itself with Osiris's effusion, such that their joining produces Egypt's natural bounty, and the Nile's annual flood is constructed as a cosmic event. Plutarch insists, however, that the idea of Egypt need not always be linked with Egypt as a place. This is a good example of a process that Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari have called deterritorialization. Deterritorialized objects and places have been uprooted from their original context, retaining only a tenuous connection to their point of origin. Because of this separation, they may then become associated with new places or remain entirely unmoored. Consequently, deterritorialized objects and places manipulate a viewer's sense of time and place, and I will continue to hit these two concepts throughout the rest of my talk. Deterritorialization happens both to Isis and to Egypt itself in the Second Sophistic. At several points, Plutarch highlights Isis's changeability, explaining how she is called by many names and forms by different people. At one point, the mythology of Isis's birth and life is recounted in a way that equates her to Greek deities. She becomes a daughter of Kronos, for example. These discussions follow the surprising assertion that Isis is a Greek word, which appears at the very beginning of the work. In reference to Egypt's landscape, Plutarch argues that the Egyptian gods should not be understood only in terms of the marshes and lotus flower of the Nile, because this would deprive the rest of the world of Isis. Instead, the gods are the same among all people, whether Greek or barbarian. The Egyptian gods now belong to a broader geography that is no longer limited to their traditional home in the Nile Valley. As a cultural concept, then, Egypt is becoming more flexible. It is no longer specific to a time or place, and it is available for reinterpretation at all points. These new readings in the Second Sophistic deterritorialize Isis and her companions, leaving them almost floating within the cosmopolitan Mediterranean world. Uprooted and unmoored, Isis and Serapis are now free to be reconfigured for Greek and Roman use. They can now find a home anywhere they travel, and those that bring them to new places only enhance the gods' power. These ideas suggest that those in power can now possess far places and experience them without even traveling there through the worship of Isis. Let us now turn to the sanctuaries themselves. At several sites, Isiac devotees chose to build along or within river estuaries. Such sites, with their loose, silty soil and their tendency to flood, are quite frankly terrible places to build. So the choice must have been symbolic. What means then would a riverine environment provide for the worship of Isis? So the Isaiah at Dion, which is in Macedonia and modern-day Greece, sat alongside the Vapiris River, which flooded frequently in antiquity and today. To emphasize that watery atmosphere further, builders set the Dion sanctuary atop several natural springs that bubbled up to fill water basins, including at the base of a cult statue dedicated to Aphrodite Hypolympidia, named for neighboring Mount Olympus. And this is in fact the only attestation of that goddess that we have. The sanctuary also had specific architectural features that reference the Nile. A pair of parallel balustrade walls punctuated by regularly spaced piers is reconstructed as a water basin by the excavators. Several scholars have identified this feature specifically as a reproduction of the Nile. The basin runs east-west across the sanctuary and may have been fed by the sanctuary's natural springs. Now by its placement in the sanctuary courtyard, the Nile basin becomes the sanctuary's focal point. It divides the sanctuary's open fort in half, and devotees would have had to walk around it in order to get from one side of the sanctuary to the other. Those visiting the sanctuary and performing everyday rites would have had to adapt pretty much all of their movements in order to account for the Nile in their midst. Many Greek sanctuaries also contained water features that were meant to replicate the equipment Egyptians used to measure and venerate the Nile's flood. In her catalog of the main cult sanctuaries across the Mediterranean, Catherine Kleivel identifies structures for water storage at the 3 Egyptian sanctuaries on the island of Delos, and at Philippi, Eretria, Thessaloniki, Messini, and Rhodes, and a handful of other sites across the Mediterranean. Now, these features take a wide range of forms, from enclosed underground cisterns to small above-ground basins set within sanctuary architecture. These structures occasionally drew from natural water sources, but more often you see the water being piped in from elsewhere, as it is here at Gortina. But many of these water facilities actually draw on Egyptian precedents in order to make those Nile references quite explicit. Some, such as the crypts at Serkei and Aeon Delos, Thessaloniki, Gortina, and Rhodes, involve descending a staircase into a cistern or water basin, which reference Egyptian structures like the Nilometer. Nilometers were structures used to measure the Nile's rise during the annual inundation that marked the beginning of the Egyptian agricultural season. In later Egyptian religion, the Nile's water is identified with Osiris and eternal life. Based on the presence of joint epigraphic venerations of Osiris and Hydrios in several sanctuaries, this meaning likely persists in Greece. In the Ptolemaic and Roman period, these structures normally take the form of long staircases leading underground to a chamber or basin within a temple complex. Many Egyptian Nilometers contain markings to help the priests measure the water levels. But in Greece, these Nilometers have no flood to measure, though several may have pumped in water to mimic the flood's effects. These structures then ask devotees to imagine themselves in the Nile, to perform acts that only make sense if the devotee exists in that specific geographic and environmental context. As a final case study, I want to focus on the sanctuary of the Egyptian gods at Marathon. We can see some of the same techniques of geographic manipulation that we have just discussed. The site selected is next to the beach, and indeed some of its remains probably lie under the sea today. Immediately to the north of the sanctuary was an artificial canal dating to the Roman period that directed much of the water emitted from a spring at the foot of Mount Angeliki around the sanctuary into the sea. The canal would have created an artificial estuary and bestowed the area with a cultivated riverine aspect, green plants, cool breezes, humid air that would have reminded the visitor of the Nile Delta. Alongside the manipulations of the sanctuary's natural environment, devotees also used architecture and sculpture to construct an Egypt that existed in deep time. The sanctuary was part of the expansive family villa that belonged to Herodes Atticus, the wealthy philosopher and imperial official with close ties to the emperor's family. We can connect several aspects with the Egyptianizing features of the Emperor Hadrian's villa at Tivoli. Given Herodes' status as an imperial official, these references also invest the sanctuary with colonial undertones. Yet Greece itself was a Roman province, and Herodes a provincial subject, albeit a well-connected and exceptionally wealthy one. The sanctuary thus operates on several intersecting interpretive levels, relying on the viewer's passage through layers of Greek, Roman, and Egyptianizing landscapes and time in order to locate the cult both in the Egyptian mythological past and the colonial Greek present. Beginning in 1999, Iphigenia and Dekulakou explored the area of the Egyptian sanctuary. Dekulakou's excavation revealed the northern half of the sanctuary square, first uncovered in the rescue excavations of the 1960s, as well as a new forecourt to the east, bordering the modern beach. She also found an epigraphic dedication by Herodes Atticus's favorite student, Polydeukion, and a pair of inscriptions referring to sacred officials working in the sanctuary. These inscriptions, along with several stylistic and technical aspects of the sculpture, securely date the sanctuary's construction to Herodes' lifetime, probably between 160 and 165 CE, and confirm the site's use as a sanctuary. Herodes, I argue, is modeling his architecture on a pastiche of stereotypical Egyptian forms. The sanctuary is organized around these two courts, both of which were decorated in a sort of Egyptianizing style. The first court, framed by a series of small rooms on the north and south, has an architectural footprint like many other buildings that you've seen throughout the Roman Empire. The western courtyard, however, takes the idiosyncratic form of a walled court with a large central pyramid. Devotees would have entered the sanctuary through a massive pylon at the east. Once inside the courtyard, devotees could have entered a highly decorated dining room that had a water feature at back. And just so that you can keep track, I've got this plan here of the site, and I'll highlight the different areas I'm speaking of just so we can kind of keep track of where we are. So inside this dining room, several sculptures were found, including a bust of Polydeukion, portrait busts of Herodes Atticus and two of his other students, Emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, were taken from the area in the 18th century and are now in the Louvre and Ashmolean museums. I will return to these busts a little bit later. Continuing on from the first courtyard, the viewer walked through another gate into a separate court. Large square pylons of Egyptian style, one in each of the four cardinal directions and connected by high walls, closed a open court and central pyramid. One lintel in Egyptianizing style, featuring cavetto cornices and a solar disk flanked by two hooded cobras, a reference to the Egyptian uraeus, was found in the ravine near the site in 1968. And two fragments of a second lintel were found inside the east court in the 2011 excavations. Dekulakou suggests that each pylon would have had a similar Egyptianizing lintel at the top of the doorway. Now, paths led from each of the four entrances to staircases, which are then flanked by small decorative sculptures of horse falcons. These staircases, in turn, led up the sides of the pyramid. At the base of these staircases were pairs of small rooms, the most important of which stood to the west of the southern staircase. Inside were found two ritually deposited statues, one a statue of Isis wearing her trademark knot, and the second a statue of a sphinx, which was actually cemented into the corner. Apparently they had to use a jackhammer to get it out. Also found in this room were nearly 70 oversized lamps with confronting busts of Isis and Serapis. These lamps had been stacked and then ritually smashed, suggesting that the room was used as a place to dispose of some of the sanctuary's most venerated objects in the late period. Now, continuing up the stairs, the devotee came to the pyramid itself, which consists at present of 3 layers of large blocks cut from limestone conglomerate that have degraded over time. I do agree this is probably the world's least impressive pyramid, but it would have been covered with marble revetments, and it's possible that there's even a 4th course that would have gone up top there. So I think it would have been much more impressive in Herodes' lifetime. Now, at the top of the pyramid, there's a cutting at present by 1 by 1.4 meters. What that is doing is very unclear. It's possible that this is meant to hold another course. It's also possible that this was meant to hold something else. Dekulaku and Pelikotiadi, who are the two excavators, think it's an obelisk. I think that the Sphinx might have actually gone up there because it's about the right size. But in any case, it's Herodes Atticus. He could have done literally anything. And it's such an idiosyncratic monument that it's really difficult to sort of guess what that would have looked like. So when viewed in concert with other elements of the sanctuary's architecture, the pyramid contributes to a sense of being in Egypt, of having left the Greek world outside the sanctuary gates on some sort of journey into a foreign place and time. The massive pylons and the architectural sculpture would have been recognizable as Egyptian, based on the fragments that remain. Now, many elite Romans did visit Egypt and saw temples and pyramids for themselves, and many more would have encountered Egypt through imported objects, souvenirs, migrants, and stories. These experiences with Egypt would have made these references easier to spot, and perhaps even enhance the cultural meanings attached to these architectural features. Along with the invocation of Egypt's monuments and the resulting manipulations of geographic space, much of the sanctuary's ideal sculpture experiments with the viewer's sense of time by imitating or alluding to the Egyptian past. Flanking each of the four pylons was a pair of over life-size statues, an Osiris and an Isis, one pair inside the pylon and a second pair outside. Each statue is carved in a heavy, blocky style and features formal elements that are typical of Egyptian sculpture, like the back pillar. These statues were particularly important elements of the sanctuary's visual landscape, creating a visual rhythm that unites the four pylons, the four staircases, the four sides of the pyramid into a cohesive whole. Remarkably, most of these statues were found tipped off of their bases and carefully buried, so we are very sure where they come from. Let's begin with the statues of Isis. In many ways, these objects do follow pharaonic Egyptian sculptural norms. They stride forward with the left leg, but keep their feet on the plinth to stay still. The bodies are stiff and positioned frontally. They hold their arms and hands close to their sides and wear Egyptian-style headgear. Three of the statues, which belong to the south, west, and north pylons, are dressed in a loose, thin chiton under a thicker, long-sleeved shift dress, both of which cling to the breast and hips. This costume is not used in Greco-Roman art, but it is depicted often in Egyptian art. They all wear their hair in Isis's traditional corkscrew curls, divided into three sausage locks that hang down over the shoulders. Each statue holds a different set of attributes that identifies her with one of the several versions of Isis popular throughout the Mediterranean. On the left, we see a statue holding sheaves of wheat, alluding to Isis Demeter. Second from left, the statue holds roses to represent Isis Aphrodite. And you also note she's got a clingier chiton where you can actually see her navel. A third holds small rolled objects, probably papyrus rolls, which are, of course, a very common feature of Egyptian statuary. This may have referred to an Isis-Aegyptiaca, who we do actually see occasionally in the epigraphy. These three statues then used iconography and poses from earlier Egyptian art in order to depict a version of Isis that's pretty syncretized with Greek goddesses. A fourth statue of Isis, the one that we saw hidden in the storage area, differs from the others, but still retains many features of pharaonic Egyptian sculpture. There are several compositional similarities between this Isis and the other three, particularly in those still feet, the lack of negative space in the composition, and the corkscrew curls in her more complicated layered hairstyle. She wears, however, a different costume, a thin, short-sleeved tunic under a heavy mantle knotted at the breasts that falls in a signature set of cascading dress folds. This costume is very popular in Isis's Greek art, appearing frequently in her statues here and also in her Athenian devotees' grave reliefs. I think it then would have felt a bit more contemporary and familiar to the average viewer. But this statue still has many features that connect the goddess back to Egypt. The Marathon Isis raises her mantle in her left hand to create a semicircular curtain of drapery, gripping fabric in her hand in a manner that may allude to a hieroglyph. In her right hand, she holds a hook, probably some sort of reimagining or adaptation of the crooks that we see frequently in New Kingdom and later Egyptian funerary art. These statues are all carved in what we might call an archaism style, such that they appear to date from an age long before their actual production in the mid-2nd century CE. Several scholars have studied archaism in Greek and Roman sculpture, in which sculptures produced in later periods, particularly the Julio-Claudian period, reproduce aspects of archaic and classical Greek art, particularly in the rendering of drapery, hairstyles, and facial features. But the Marathon statues are looking far beyond the Greek past. With their stiff, upright postures, their back pillars, and their Egyptian-style garments, these objects follow earlier Egyptian representational norms. They do not reference styles used in Hellenistic or Roman Egypt. Just like the textual accounts of the Nile, these statues are alluding to a general, vague long ago. Now, why might Herodes have taken this approach? Because of its particular meaning for statues of gods, archaism would have been especially useful for representing the relatively new arrivals of Greek Egyptian deities. Josh Elsner has argued that archaism offers legitimacy to new cults, recalls lost or supposedly lost objects, and renders images otherworldly. More importantly, by manipulating the viewer's sense of the age of the object, the statue becomes timeless, a part of myth time rather than historical time, or even human time. The timelessness of these objects intersects with their Egyptianness. Scholars have used the term Pharaonizing to refer to this stylistic trope. Pharaonizing sculpture, as defined by Katie Barrett, emulates attributes, iconographies, conventions, proportions, and postures found in Egyptian art of the Pharaonic period. The style seems to have been especially appropriate for sculpture, which could borrow earlier Egyptian styles and formats from statuettes that we know circulated widely and easily along Mediterranean trade routes. The allusions in the examples studied here are not grounded in any specific dynasty or period, but again, in this generalized, almost mythological sense of Egypt before. Like the examples that we see in the literature, this version of Egypt functions on a cosmic timescale, unlike the shorter rhythms of historical time that often characterize ideas of Greekness in the Roman Empire. These statues then look past the present towards this vague stereotyped Egyptian past, erasing Egypt's historical timescale in the process. Now, alongside these cosmic timescales of the Isis statues, the sanctuary's male sculptures also make some contemporary claims on Roman power that serve Herodes' political and cultural interests. The 4 male statues that stood alongside the Isis statues also wear Egyptianizing costumes and are carved in Pharaonizing formats and styles. With their arms held close to the side, they hold the small cylindrical objects that we see so frequently in Egyptian sculpture. Each male wears a belted Egyptian shendet kilt with a codpiece. The West Pylon statue preserves a conical calathos that stood on top of the Nemes wig, and it's likely that all the male statues wore the same headgear. Though this form usually represents a pharaoh in Egyptian art, the Marathon statues most likely represent the Egyptian god Osiris. These statues diverge from the more popular god Serapis' types, which wear Greek clothing and depict the god with shaggy hair and a beard. The contrast suggests that Marathon statues are depicting another Egyptian god whose sculptural types are not well defined in Greco-Roman art. As a popular figure in Second Sophistic literature who received venerations at several Greek sanctuaries, Osiris is the most likely candidate. The identification as Osiris is also appealing because of the similarities between these statues and the images of Osiris Antinous from Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli. The Marathon and Tivoli examples wear the same kilts, carry the same objects, they have the same headdress, and their bodies are posed in similar ways. The Marathon statue, however, shouldn't be considered like a direct copy. The difference in style would have produced 2 quite divergent interpretations. The Tivoli Osiris is carved in a very contemporary Roman style, lacks a back pillar, and produces something that feels a bit more timely, contemporaneous, and alive. Though the statue lacks clear portrait features, a mid-2nd century CE viewer would still be able to infer from style that this statue stands somewhere between divinity and portrait. The Pharaonizing style of the Marathon example, on the other hand, argues for its antiquity and sacrality. The stiffness of the posture, the heaviness of the body and carving, and the lack of a clear reference to any person would have made the Marathon statue seem much older, even though it was probably produced shortly after the Tivoli Osiris. It is hard to argue that Herodes and his sculptors were not inspired, at least in part, by the Tivoli statue. But the Marathon example is better understood as an adaptation of an iconographic type to suit Herodes' desire to legitimate his temple and make it seem older. Buildings like those at Tivoli that include Egyptian themes, including the Canopeon, the Tinoeon, and the Palaestra, form a significant part of Herodes' inspiration for the whole complex. Both the Tivoli and Marathon villas imagine fantastic versions of Egypt that are simultaneously domesticated, ordered, and contained within the Roman world. According to a passage in the Historia Augusta, from which the popular modern name Canopeum is derived, this building was one of many within the Tivoli Villa named for important places in the Eastern Roman Empire, including sites named for places like the Lyceum, Academia, Prytaneum, and Tempe. Viewed in this light, the Tivoli Villa becomes a geographic metaphor, a site designed to present an easily digestible representation of empire through Greek and Greek-looking material culture. Similarly, Herodes may have seen an Egyptian sanctuary within the confines of the villa as an illusion that would have appealed to other elite members of his social circles, and used the portraits that I mentioned earlier to heighten that effect. So returning to these portraits inside room A of the East Court, we find this portrait bust of Polydeukion, Herodes' foster son student. The Polydeukion bust has very similar formal and stylistic and technical parallels with the busts of Herodes, Marcus Aurelius, and Lucius Verus that were found nearby in the 18th century. We can reconstruct a symmetrical set of pairs based on Herodes and his pupils. Herodes and Polydeukion in the Greek Himation, Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius in the Roman military costume. I think that Herodes includes these portraits in the sanctuary in order to highlight his complementary roles as Greek philosopher and Roman political official and ground it in his Egyptian cult. First, the busts promote Herodes' identity as intellectual, connecting him with this long tradition of philosopher portraits that have used this specific costume throughout the Great East. As the former tutor, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, as well as a major patron of the Athenian school of the Middle Platonists, Herodes has a prominent role in the Athenian imperial philosophical community that grants him a high status among the intellectuals who would have visited the sanctuary. These images, however, also draw attention to another aspect of Herodes' biography, his participation in the imperial and provincial governance of the Roman Empire. Herodes served as archon at Athens, senator at Rome, and as a prefect of Asia. Including military rather than intellectual portraits of the emperors may have alluded to this aspect of his life and underscored his political powers alongside his intellectual prominence. Herodes and his viewers are seeking narratives that would embellish their own place in the empire and its narratives of global power and peace that have been achieved through conquest. As Barrett has argued, this version of Egypt presented at Tivoli is one of productive and peaceful partnership, where Hadrian and his successors seek to represent themselves as the founder of a new golden age, achieved in Rome that's been achieved through partnership between the colonizer and the colonized. This method of representation was a technique that turned architectural placemaking into a metaphor of Roman imperialism. This very convenient fiction, which overlooks the ongoing strife in the empire's borderlands and the rebellions within it, also underpinned Herodes' own rather rosy version of Rome. The Marathon's villa's artistic references to the Tivoli Villa cast Herodes as a participant in this new Antonine Golden Age, as someone who, like the emperors, could domesticate the foreign and enjoy leisure activities in a collapsed imperial geography and timescale. Placed in a domestic sphere, this deterritorialized Egypt is now an idyllic sacred space inflected with the wondrous and exotic Egyptian culture of a timeless Egyptian deep past. The site then becomes a way for Herodes and his family and friends to position themselves alongside the emperors, to grant themselves a higher and more central position in the Roman world. The Greek provincial viewer has become the agent of control rather than its victim. All right, so wrapping it all up. The sanctuary at Marathon demonstrates the ways in which devotees constructed Nilotic landscapes and temporalities in Greek sanctuaries. In Marathon, the Egyptianizing architecture worked with the Pharaonizing sculpture and the Nilotic landscape in order to transport the viewer into this imagined Egyptian past, one that exists beyond the bounds of natural geography or human time. In addition to creating an environment that supported the cult's rituals, I argue, these sanctuaries reclaimed Egypt's deterritorialized aspects for Greek devotees. Underlying this experience was a background of Roman imperialism, highlighted by a set of imperial portraits that have been set up inside the sanctuary. Through its sculptural allusions to Hadrian's Tivoli Villa, the sanctuary reminded Herodes and perhaps of their own involvement in the expansion of imperial power. Now, while Herodes' sanctuary is unusual in many ways, it is perhaps best understood as the logical extreme of many popular aspects of Isiac sanctuary design in Greece. Looking at the frequent presence of water features at other sites in Greece suggests that many communities chose to include allusions to the Nile River, its water, and the divinities embodied by it in their sacred architecture. While we have very little wall painting remaining from Roman Greece, the painted decorations that once stood in these sanctuaries could have included Nilotic iconography in order to strengthen these connections. The architectural allusions and natural landscapes construct multidimensional and sensory experiences of Egypt for devotees, right in their own hometowns. Set in provincial Greece, the Nilotic aesthetic takes a new meaning. By deterritorializing Egypt and setting it within Greek sacred spaces, these sanctuaries follow the imperial norm of presenting a diverse empire in harmony, a most convenient fiction. The aesthetic's main purpose, then, was to grant its viewers a sense of control over distant places, to locate Greek culture and the Greeks that practiced it at the very center of Roman power. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for this immensely rich and interesting talk. I'm sure there will be many questions and maybe comments. You can use Zoom's raise hand feature if you want to ask a question, or just type in the chat. So feel free to join the discussion, everyone. Yeah, we'll start right away with Jasmine.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. I love to see how these different sanctuaries around the ancient world are kind of like trying to create their own Niles, and that seems like really exciting aspect. I have a couple of questions. One is about the Isis statues. So I've studied a little bit of Egyptian art, and something whilst the sheath dress style is something that I'm very familiar with from like the way that women generally are shown in Egyptian statues. Something that strikes me is that like these look really different because of like the folds of the material and things. So I wondered if you had anything, any sort of comment about like an adaptation of an Egyptian style of dress or something going on there. And then my other question is about to what extent like the way that the Isis cult gets spread around the ancient world perhaps influences how, say, Europeans in like the 18th and 19th century going to Egypt were receiving the culture that they experienced there. Were they looking back to how the Greeks and Romans thought about Egypt and projecting that onto what they saw?
So thank you for your questions. I think I'm very ill-equipped to answer the second one, which is a very good question, but I think there are probably people even in this Zoom room that know way more about that than I do. But I'm happy to talk about the first one. So one of the things that's really interesting about this is, as you noted, this does not look like, I mean, in Egyptian art, they're so smooth. There's all those planes. And I think part of it is Herodes these are clearly special commissions. They're made in Athens. The sculptural technique is undeniable. And you know, Athenian art in this period, they're obsessed with these very deep drill, like heavily drilled drapery folds. That's how you show your excellence as a sculptor. So I think one part of it is that he doesn't want them to, because he could, you know, go steal a statue. He has the money. And he could presumably pay an Egyptian sculptor to make one, but he's made this very particular choice. And in the book, I argue that part of what's going on is here, they want the statues to be made in Greek materials, and they want them to be made in Greek style because the version of Isis that they've made is very deeply tied with this idea of her being in Greece. I think I have a slide at the end here. I tend to keep things. So this is one of the erotology. So in the Greek-speaking world, I think there's about 7 or 8 of these hymns, which purport to be copied from the Temple of Ptah at Memphis in some ways, but we get these things like here, this one's from Maronesia and Thrace, and she's taking over Demeter's role as the Eleusinian mysteries goddess. And so they're like rewriting the Homeric hymn to Demeter. They're going very deep into the canon to make Isis fit in there. And I think that's for me, a big part of why these statues don't go that direction, why that choice is not being made.
Thank you. That's really, really fascinating.
I'm sorry. I wish I had better things to say about your second brilliant question.
Anyone else with questions? I'm sure there are many. While you are thinking, I'll go ahead with my own one. It's maybe a naive question. I'm not sure there's an answer for it. But you mentioned that there are very few imported objects in the sanctuaries from Egypt. Are there any traces of Egyptians that entered these sanctuaries, or not these or other ones in Greece? Because that would be interesting to know if they had any role in forming how these evolved.
Yes, so I should say, first of all, that this lack of imports seems specific to Greece. My colleagues that work in, Dalmatia, in Italy, elsewhere in the Mediterranean, they have tons of imports. They're just chock full of imports, and I don't know why. Well, I think I know why. That my argument, as I sort of just stated, is why they're not choosing to import, and in particular, I think part of what's going on is a general change in the cult over time. So most of the imports that we do have date to the earlier Hellenistic period, and they're probably they come from island sites. Like there's a bunch from Rhodes, like I think half of the corpus comes from Rhodes. There's a few on Delos. There's this one in Thessaloniki. And what's quite interesting is in this initial sort of phase, you have attestations of Egyptians, or what we think are Egyptians, and they're advertising it. They want you to know that they're Egyptian. And Ian Moyer makes a really compelling argument for the Delian sanctuaries, that there's competition, and one of the things you could be doing is branding. Like, we have a real Egyptian here, and this is sort of in the early periods in the 4th and early 3rd century BC. You also have people going to Amphipolis, to Demetrius, these sort of big port cities, and their names drop out. We stop seeing Egyptian names and people really trading on that Egyptian identity pretty early. I think about the 2nd century BC is about when you last see the end. Now, of course, that's problematic because many Egyptians have Greek names. We know that there are Egyptian migrants and Egyptian traders everywhere. But they're not trading on it anymore. So it's possible that they stop engaging in this and this becomes completely appropriated by Greeks. It's possible that we have people who now decided that they want to use only a Greek name in the epigraphy. And I have this really bizarre inscription from Thessaloniki where I've got an Italian guy who has a Greek nickname that he puts up in this votive inscription. So he's got like a full trianomina, and then he's Epikalumenos Demetrios. That's one of my favorite inscriptions. So it does seem to be also in these early periods a place where you have people from all over kind of meeting, but using Greekness as a sort of like a conduit to enable those interactions.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, Solange.
Hi, thank you for this talk, Lindsey. I just finished reading your book and really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my question, I guess, is sort of more basic or essential, if you will. And I see through your presentation that Isis in this context is essentially being made into a Greek goddess. And so I'm curious to know, what was the original appeal? Why was it that she had so many devotees in Greece? There were so many goddesses to choose between to sort of take home and turn into a Greek goddess. What do you think was sort of the original attraction of this particular goddess?
That's a really good question. I think in terms of what makes her popular, I think it's her sort of soter thing. So this idea that she will directly appear to you. There's this almost enhanced epiphanic expectation. We have lots of votives that seem to be commemorating epiphanic experiences, whether through, we know they do ritual incubation at several sites for healing. So we get their footprint reliefs. So that is probably a holdover from the Egyptian context, and although it's obviously not working in the same way as it does in Egypt. Ear reliefs that seem to sort of say, hear my prayer. Sometimes eyes. But so that seems to be one aspect of it that's very popular. I think another part of it is, and this is the hypothesis I advanced in chapter 2. I think it's a really social cult. I think it's one of these cults where you can be there every day with your small group. Then there's the associations in there, and I think it provides sort of an ordering of life and social, and a very sort of strong social network, particularly in these early periods where the cult seems to be thriving in places where you have people that are highly mobile and probably looking for community outside of traditional family and social networks. That's one aspect of it. In terms of the theology, I think that the Soter is probably one big aspect of it, and they really seem very intent. Because the funerary aspects don't seem to come over. They're not particularly interested in that aspect of her cult here. They are elsewhere. But they really do seem very particularly interested in her as sort of this like henotheistic goddess that takes one, brings together all of these different deities. And so there's some sense in which too she kind of bridges all of these cultural gaps for them. So that's the best answer I've come up with, but I don't really know that that's a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jasmine?
Sorry, I have more questions. So I was wondering, from sort of leading from that, about why Isis doesn't get like a Greek name in the way that, say, you could, I don't know, you think of there being like syncretism between, say, like Thoth and Hermes and things like that Isis sort of retains her own identity. And then I do have a second question.
Sorry about that.
My second question is about the cosmic elements that you mentioned, this sort of interpretation of Isis and Osiris and their links with the inundation and everything. And I was wondering if there's any connection there with the kind of cosmic interpretations that you get for like Egyptian temples and that sort of thing. And yeah, whether that's like coming through from the early cults when perhaps it's being propagated by migrants from Egypt particularly.
So they actually they don't transliterate any of the names. They do, so every once in a while, like you'll get some sort of name, like Plutarch claims like the Isis comes from the Greek verb oida, which simultaneously means I have seen and I know. That's nonsense. There's no way that actually works, but that's one way that they do explain it. Then, I think also too, the hard work has been done for them in Ptolemaic Egypt of trying to deal with that particular problem. So they don't have to wrestle with it in the same way that people living in Ptolemaic Egypt did. In terms of things carrying over, so Katie Barrett has some interesting arguments about some things potentially carrying over from Hellenistic figurines, so potentially molds being shipped up. And it's difficult to say, right, what practices are specifically happening, what beliefs are being, and like what thought worlds are being brought along. We just don't have enough of evidence that we can specifically tie to Egyptians beyond just they're dedicating temples. So in that sense, they're behaving in ways that are very similar to their Greek counterparts in these early phases. There is one guy, Demetrius, the Uaphres, son of Horus. He depicts himself with a shaved head and wearing this garment that they all wear, which looks like a towel that you've rolled up after taking a shower. And that he's wearing that costume, which seems to be consistent with what we see in Pompeii later on, and what I think we see in Egyptian religion at this point. But I guess I don't really know that they're bringing over Isis's cosmic element. And the sort of the early thing is, Isis has such a long life and she changes so much. And also, so I'm sorry, I keep giving you very unsatisfactory answers.
No, it's really good. It's so interesting to be kind of looking. It seems like it's kind of on the edge of two cultures, and therefore like trying to quite define what things come from is very difficult. So I appreciate that and thank you.
Yeah, Beth.
Hi, Lenny.
Hi,
I'm just gonna. Nice to see you too. I'm just gonna read what I had written in the chat. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about any specifically Greek and not Ptolemaic influences that you see in Roman worship. Are they distinguishable to you at all?
That's tough because they are picking up a lot from the Ptolemaic Egypt. The sculptural types for all three of the main gods are already extant in Ptolemaic Egypt. I'm a little bit shaky on the Anubis ones because there's a tendency to put a particular type of Hermes statue that doesn't have a head and just assume it had an Anubis head in Greece, and I'm a little bit hesitant to do that. And so the sculptural types are coming across clearly certain ideas about water and Osiris and the sacrality of water are coming across as well. In terms of things that are not, that's not tough. I have to think and go through. One thing that Ian Moyer has suggested is that because the Isis Serapis cults get incorporated into civic religion pretty early, you actually have priests in most cases by the 2nd century BC. They're being picked by the city rather than the priesthoods being handed down on a familial line. So I guess that would be one thing that does significantly diverge. We do have the two main festivals they're probably adapted, but in some way, but they don't seem to be. But they, I think, do have some sort of Egyptian precedent. The sailing festival in the spring, and then the Isaiah and I think November. And so I think that's one aspect that probably just the priesthoods are the thing that jumps to mind. But I can think on that question a little bit more and send you an email once I've run through some more things in my notes.
Thanks. Thought I'd give you a tough one. Sorry.
It's okay. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Simon, would you like to read your question?
Hi, yeah, thanks for that, Lindsay. That was a fascinating talk. So I was quite interested because you talked about the imaginary Egypt created through like landscape and architecture, but I was also interested in other elements that might evoke that Egypt. But what about Egyptian animals? Were they kind of ever used in the temples, and in what ways, if they were? Thanks.
That's a great question. And I think there's like one brief mention of a crocodile somewhere in the sanctuary of the Isis Canopeum in Rome. And Martin Bomas wants to extrapolate from that and say there were crocodiles everywhere. It reminds me of, I went to an American university. We have mascots, and the mascot for my university was a bear. And like a grizzly bear. And I remember they gave us some sort of playing card, and they described how in the early 20s, a bunch of young men had caught a bear and they were using it as the mascot. And I think the term they describe it with varying degrees of success. And that is what I imagine would happen if you brought a crocodile and put it in a urban sanctuary. That being said, I think the only real faunal evidence that we have from Greece comes from Delos. And there we're just seeing like chickens, fruits and vegetables, cakes as the main sacrifices. That being said, I would not be surprised, particularly for some place like Marathon, if there were just ibises everywhere and lots of lotus plants haven't brought it. I can easily imagine, particularly in some of the wealthier areas, some enhancements being brought in, especially considering how vibrant the trade in wild animals generally from North Africa was.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Thank you.
We have one more question in the chat from Lindsey. I don't know, Lindsey, are you here?
Yes. Yes. Oh, sorry. But you're saying mine.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Linnea. I had a question. I was wondering, and I'm sorry if this is too simple, but when did the Greeks first start appropriating Isis and Egyptian gods and goddesses and things Egyptian in general? I mean, maybe you could, I don't know if it's too simplistic, talk a little bit more about the Egyptian influence on the broader Mediterranean world a little bit at all.
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead.
When did they start making it a mythological place?
So we have evidence of Egyptian contact with the Greek mainland very, very early. I know at Mycenae, at the Citadel, there were pieces of royal cartouches found, for example. So the contact has been there forever. And my colleague Nick Blackwell, who works on Mycenaean geopolitics, has argued, I think, pretty convincingly that Ahiwa and Mycenaean Greece is really the small little brother that's not really at the level of the Hittites and the Egyptians in sort of the games that are going on at that point, but they are involved. We found lots of Egyptian imports at several sites like Naupactus in the Peloponnese, and other colleagues have worked on that material. And there are Greek colonies in the Nile Delta, I think from as early as sort of the fifth century BC, perhaps even a little bit earlier. And so the question becomes, and I think that the question becomes, how do we untangle all of this? Because from the 5th century BC, Herodotus is there, and he's already drawing equivalences between Egyptian gods and Greek gods in particular. That's something he's very interested in, and the cultures have already started, exchanging, commingling very, very early. So in some sense, I don't think it's worthwhile to even peel them apart, because I think that they put themselves together for many, many reasons. We do see an intensification of those connections during the Ptolemaic period, when the Ptolemaic Empire is involved in 1,000 wars in the Eastern Mediterranean, and is in contact with a lot of with the Achaemenids as well. So it's really a question of, when do we want to pull it apart? When do we want to say it started, or do we want to say that this is a standard cultural feature of the Mediterranean, that Egypt had always had significant overseas influence because of its economic power, and other areas are interested in, overcome by, defeat Egypt at various points.
Thank you very much.
Okay, any more questions, comments from the audience? I have a small one about the not really Osiris-looking Osiris statues at Marathon. Actually, two questions. First is, what size are they? Maybe I just missed that and you said it, but are they life-size statues?
Yes, they are. I'm pulling them up again for us. So yes, they are. The ones from Marathon they're pretty over life size. I think they're like, I have it written down in the article I published on this. I think it's, and I can send that to you for the precise measurements, but I think that they're like 1.6, 1.8 meters, something like that. They're quite large. And it's been a while since I've seen the Tivoli one. Bet would know better than I would how big it is, but that one's certainly life size or over.
Yeah, that I know. And the ones at Marathon, do they have any inscription at all? No, they're not.
Sadly, no, they don't. The only inscriptions we have are the dedication. We have three. We have the dedication Polydeukion, one that says like Kyrios, and then one that references a guy who we think might have been a priest there. And there did recently find some Egyptian hairpins in the living quarters area. So the more recent excavations have been going to the southern part. So over this area, investigating this area in between the Egyptian sanctuary and the bath complex, these seem to be living quarters for the priests. And so that they did find one set of Egyptian hairpins.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Solange again. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I just wanted to go back to your comment about how useful is it to pull the two apart, since the cultures around the Eastern Mediterranean were so interwoven. But I think that it is vital to pull them apart, in fact, because the various manifestations of Isis worship around the Eastern Mediterranean become very, very different than what you see in the homeland, in the indigenous traditions, and a lot will be lost if we just sort of look at it as a generic Isis worship in this late period. So I just wanted to make a plug for that. And then, of course, again, you see something totally different, but much more similar to the Egyptian practice happening in Nubia. So.
Yeah, sorry, I might have misstated that. I think that we should pull them apart and then bring them back together again, and pull them apart and bring them back together again. Because you're right, it is not worthwhile to say this just appears fully formed from the head of Zeus, right? That's not true. I think that it is worthwhile, again, to look at these really local, as much as you can, traditions. I mean, I set my book in a region, and I think the last chapter I said I failed at the local, so I hope somebody else can do the local, because I just couldn't get there in my book. But I take your point. I think it's a really good point, and so thank you for raising that.
Peter?
Oh, Peter, I think you're on mute.
You are muted.
Right. No, I'm not. Thank you for that wonderful paper. I really enjoyed it. And I just wanted to ask, because it seemed to me, you've got two very fascinatingly detailed studies of what were must have been quite extraordinary architectural complexes in their own time. The Marathon one and the Tivoli one. And I was wondering, because the Iseum that I'm most familiar with, and I guess a lot of people probably are, is the Pompeian one, which is very much, I guess, what you said about this kind of creation of a bucolic Nilotic fantasy world is very much true of that as well. But it's right in the middle of urban space, and I mean, you have a real sense of. I've never had a stronger sense than visiting the Iseum in Pompeii of a religious community would have functioned. You have a real sense of the concreteness and the sort of warmth of that small community in that small architectural space in the middle of the thriving town. And I was wondering if you could say a little more about what the urban sanctuaries in the Greek world looked like.
Yeah. So in one way, the Gortina one and the Dion one Dion is just outside the city wall. You can throw a rock and hit the city wall. And Gortina, I think it's right next to an Apollo sanctuary. I don't think we know exactly where the city wall is. I'm not sure if that one's intra-urban or it's just extra-urban. So in some sense, almost all of these, except for the Marathon one, are actually urban sanctuaries. And there's some really interesting ways that you have to think about that, because so Eva Moll, your former colleague, she's written a really interesting article about the role of walls. Almost all these sanctuaries are walled, just like the one in Pompeii. So there is a sense that we want to create layers of segregation around the cult. But at the same time, it's very clear these people love a procession. And not only do they love a procession, they love a procession where everyone wears a weird outfit and plays a weird instrument and screams. So there's a certain performative element to this as well, that this is performatively weird. And it's performatively exciting. And I think Valentino Gasparini has also pointed out as well that a lot of these temples are built right next to theaters. And so it's clear that ritual drama must be like a very important part of this. And it probably isn't that secret. So there is a way in which it's both a cult that insists on secrecy, insists on segregation, but also wants to perform its specialness, its weirdness for everyone to see.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jeremy?
Yes, thanks very much. I wanted to ask a question about knowledge of iconography and also transmission of that knowledge, because one of the points that you mentioned was how little the Isis statues seem to go back to archaic or Hellenistic Greek kind of archaizing models, and that there was very specific knowledge of Egyptian iconographic ideas that was involved in them. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about where you thought that specific knowledge of Egyptian iconography was coming from and how it was being transmitted, so how people would get to know it. And if we're thinking in terms of workshops, do you think that the workshop that Herodes Atticus commissioned these statues from would have been a kind of specialist do Egyptian style objects workshop with that kind of specialist knowledge? Or do you think that pretty much any good workshop you could go to and they would be able to knock you up some pretty decent Pharaonizing statues?
So the transmission question is to me an interesting one, and one that's been well studied. Sabina Albersmeyer has a book on Ptolemaic queens, and it seems like that might be a key venue for the transmission, particularly of what Isis is going to look like. So it seems, because I mean the Arsinoides are picking up her iconography, they're using it in their portraiture. And it does seem like there are Alexandrian sculpture workshops that are they're definitely in dialogue with Crete, possibly Athens. I think they're much more popular in the Western Empire. So that could be one aspect of it. Kaylee Barrett has also pointed out the importance of terracotta figurines and small statuettes as a key vector for the transmission of these. And so she's worked on that material at Pompeii a little bit later, as well as the Hellenistic figurines on Delos, which I think would have been probably the more direct transmission. We also have a very cool inscription from Delos that describes, it's a two-part verse inscription that describes the arrival of the founder of the Egyptian cult of Serapeion A to Delos, and he actually is described as carrying the statue under his arm on the boat and bringing it to Delos that way. So that's another possible vector of transmission. Ian Moyer has that as a translation, that inscription as an appendix in his book. So I think there's a lot of possible vectors of transmission, but at the same time, once she arrives, they do go through this process of translation and sort of picking which aspects they want. And so I think there are places where you can see this sort of process of experimentation. There's a head of Isis at Thessaloniki, for example, that is recut to have a corkscrew curl hairstyle, which I think is probably, well, we have this statue, we need it to be Isis now, let's recut it. And so you can see these places with experimentation and sort of design. And the statue of Serapis may actually initially come from the Black Sea. There's a terracotta that's very early that's depicting Serapis, and I think Clement of Alexandria claims that it came from Sinope anyway, so that's one other possible vector of transmission. In terms of the workshop, I think it would have been a not, for some of these, I think they would have been not particularly difficult. So the statue of Isis with the knot, this is an iconography that we see on 1/5 of all Athenian funerary monuments, like all of the stele. So I think that's an iconography they probably feel very comfortable with. That being said, these are ugly statues. They're not very good. And they aren't, really allowing the sculptor to show off their technique, and they're trying to look, bad. So it's probably the same workshop that's making those busts, which are considered to be, some of the great busts in later Roman portraiture. So I think it's something where you are looking at perhaps a workshop doing a special commission, whether they felt. I don't think there's a special Veronizing sculpture workshop at Athens, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think this is just a, your run-of-the-mill, well, probably a very high-end sculptural workshop. That would be my guess.
And so you're suggesting that the quality of them is because they're not that used to doing them, or not particularly committed to this particular style of object, as it were?
I think part of it is he quickly puts in a weird request. He's asking that we want them to be old, we want them to be archaizing, but we don't want them to look too old. We don't want them to be too Greek or too Egyptian. You have to depict gods and goddesses that we don't normally depict in this way. So they had a long list of requirements, and it was probably not very easy to fulfill this requirement. We all know how Hurries is obsessed with statues, so he probably was picky too.
Really interesting. Thanks.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yes, Simon, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, Lindsay, something you said earlier about the ritual performance and kind of, I think you said performatively weird about the processions. I found that quite interesting. I was just wondering, can we actually tell from the archaeology what the rituals would have looked like in these sites, especially like with the water features and if they were flooded as well? Because I imagine they'd look quite impressive, especially if it was lamplight. But is there anything we can tell from the archaeology, like where people would have stood or anything like that?
So I mean, with archaeology and religion, you're always doing quite a bit of guesswork. In terms of the Marathon sanctuary, I don't think I included a plan in this PowerPoint, which was a mistake on my part. But it is thought that there would have been, there's these shaded porticos, and that may have been a place where people both engaged in ritual incubation and potentially watched. Other places you have, I don't think we have any sort of portrait monuments from these ones. The Cortino one has a bit, again, a portico around an open courtyard, and same with the Delos ones as well. So that seems to be the place where, you would watch. They almost all have these large open courts that would be good for massing these types of processions. We also have some wall paintings depicting people engaging in these activities. They're from Pompeii and Herculaneum. The Herculaneum ones are a bit more famous, and we don't really know what their use context was. So it's a question of, are these being made by people who actually engage in the rites, or are they just sort of outsiders who are kind of generalizing? But we do see people wearing very, cult-specific costumes. And in the interior of the Pompeiiseum, we do see also, we see priests engaging. And so some of them, for example, we know that there's, at some sites, a guy called an Anubophore, and his job is to wear a hat, like a headdress of Anubis, and walk around in the procession, like a sports mascot. And so we know that there are certain people who do dress up as the gods in particular. And we also, we have the description in Annapolis's Metamorphoses, which goes into particular detail, and people go back and forth on how useful they think that is. But I think that's a detail that could have been verified. So I tend to take him at his word at that point, that there are people who are dressing up as the gods. There's also a passage in, I think, the Suetonius's Life of Domitian, where he is escaping from Rome because he's about to get assassinated, and he dresses up as a priest of Isis. So that only works if people are wandering around the streets dressed up in weird Isiac costumes. You would certainly want to draw more attention to yourself as you're trying to flee your assassinate, what would be assassins in Rome. So I that's the main evidence for it, I believe.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? I think Jeremy just left the sign up, but do you have one more question, Jeremy? Probably not. Anyone else? Last chance. Feel free to go.
Well, thank you everyone for coming and for staying till the bitter end. It was a real pleasure to speak to you all.
Well, thank you, Lindsey, for this fascinating lecture.